The cold Montana wind cut through the parking lot of Thompson's General Store, rattling the street signs and sending a swirl of brittle leaves dancing across the asphalt. It was late autumn in Helena, Montana, and the sky hung low, gray and heavy, as if winter were already pressing its way into the valley. Inside a weathered blue Chevy sedan, Lucy Adams, a 6-year-old girl with large, watchful eyes, sat quietly in the back seat, her tiny fingers wrapped around the well-worn ear of Benny, her stuffed rabbit. She wasn't afraid of waiting alone in the car. Her stepmother, Carolyn Adams, had only run inside for a few groceries. But the air inside the vehicle felt different today, heavier somehow, like something unseen was waiting just beyond her line of sight. Then, from the shadows near the dumpster, they emerged. 3 German shepherds, massive, alert, and purposeful, stepped forward as if drawn by an invisible force. Their amber eyes locked onto the car with an intensity that sent a chill down Lucy's spine. These weren't stray dogs sniffing for scraps. They moved with precision, with intent. The largest of them, a battle-worn dog with a scar running across its muzzle, placed its front paws against the driver's side window. His breath fogged the glass just inches from Lucy's face. She gripped Benny tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. The second dog, leaner but just as imposing, circled behind the car, momentarily vanishing from view. The third, a female with a sleeker build, positioned herself by the passenger door. Lucy wasn't sure why, but she didn't feel the urge to scream. She should have been terrified, but something about the way the dogs moved, their calculated steps, their silent, expectant posture, kept her frozen in place, more curious than afraid. And then she heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Carolyn Adams had just exited the store, her brown paper grocery bags balanced against her hip, her mind already on the long drive back to their struggling farm. But the moment her gaze lifted and met the sight before her, the bags slipped from her grasp. Glass shattered, and a bottle of milk burst across the pavement, pooling like white ink at her feet. She stopped mid-step. The 3 German shepherds had her car surrounded. For a long moment, the only sound in the parking lot was the howl of the wind and the faint rustling of leaves scraping against metal. Carolyn's breath caught in her throat. Her body tensed, old instincts screaming at her to run. Because Carolyn Adams was afraid of dogs. Not just wary, not just uncomfortable, afraid. It was a fear rooted deep in her past, tangled in memories of a childhood attack that had left her with jagged scars on her forearm and a paralyzing distrust of any animal with sharp teeth and powerful jaws. And now, here she stood, face to face with 3 of them. One of them, the largest with the scar, turned its head toward her, its amber eyes unreadable. The weight of its gaze pinned her to the spot. For a split second, Carolyn thought she saw recognition. Then, it bared its teeth, not in a snarl, not in a growl, but in a brief flash of white, something almost like an acknowledgement. Carolyn's pulse pounded in her ears. Her stepdaughter was inside that car. Summoning every ounce of courage, she forced herself forward, step by step. "Lucy," she called, her voice higher than normal, strained at the edges. "Honey, are you okay?" The child nodded behind the glass, her small face wide-eyed but calm. "They're not bad," she said softly. "They just want something." Carolyn swallowed, her throat dry. Her instincts told her to turn and leave, to find help, but something about Lucy's unwavering certainty gave her pause. Still, her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, dialing Frank Adams, her husband. No answer. She tried again. Still no answer. With her heart hammering, Carolyn dialed the local animal control office. After explaining the situation, she was met with a tired sigh on the other end of the line. "We're short-staffed," the dispatcher said. "Best we can do is send someone in about 3 hours." Carolyn's gaze flickered back to the car, to the 3 looming figures standing like sentinels around her stepdaughter. 3 hours was too long. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something, a glint of metal beneath the thick fur of the scarred dog's collar. Collars. They weren't strays. The realization made her breath hitch. If they had owners, why were they out here, seemingly alone? Gathering her courage, she cracked the car door open just slightly, enough to test their reaction. The scarred dog stepped back but didn't run. The others remained still, watching her every move. She reached out, fingers hesitant, and grasped the worn leather collar of the largest one. It was thick and old, marked with scratches and age. And attached to it, almost hidden in the fur, was something unexpected, a small cylindrical container, like something one might see on a search and rescue dog. Carolyn's breath caught in her throat. She unscrewed the cap with shaking hands and pulled out a tightly rolled slip of waterproof paper. Inside, written in meticulous but labored handwriting, were words that made her knees nearly buckle. "My name is Robert Callahan, U.S. Army, retired. If you are reading this, I have likely passed away or been forced to leave my home. These dogs, Max, Duke, and Lady, have been my family and my salvation for 8 years. Max, the scarred one, was my service dog after my last tour in Vietnam. Duke and Lady were trained support animals before joining our family. My neighbor, Thomas Grayson, promised to ensure their safety if anything happened to me, but I no longer trust his intentions. These dogs are highly trained and valuable. They deserve to stay together with someone who will love them as I have. They may be seeking familiar scents or faces. Please help them." Carolyn's fingers tightened around the paper. She looked up, meeting Max's steady, unflinching gaze. Then she glanced at Lucy, who was now leaning forward, one small hand pressed to the window, her breath fogging the glass. "We can't leave them," Lucy whispered. "They're looking for home." Carolyn's heart clenched. The dogs weren't just wandering. They were searching. And somehow, by some unseen force, they had found her. She exhaled slowly, gripping the note in one hand while dialing Frank's number again with the other. This time, he answered. And when she spoke, the words felt heavier than she ever expected. "Frank," she said, glancing down at the 3 expectant faces staring up at her. "We have a problem." And just like that, the course of their lives was about to change forever. The drive back to the Adams farm was a quiet one, filled with unspoken tension. The wind had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the old blue Chevy's windows. The weight of the note in Carolyn's hands felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the burden of a man's last desperate hope. Lucy sat in the back seat, her tiny fingers threading absently through Lady's thick fur. The female German shepherd had taken to the girl immediately, curling up against her side as if she had always belonged there. Max and Duke, however, sat in the back of the car with military precision, their bodies stiff, their eyes locked on the road ahead as if scanning for threats. Carolyn kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror. These weren't ordinary dogs. They carried themselves with a discipline, a purpose, that set them apart from any stray or lost pet she'd ever encountered. And then there was the note. It wasn't just a plea for help, it was a warning. Thomas Grayson. The name unsettled her. If Robert Callahan, a Vietnam veteran, hadn't trusted his own neighbor, there had to be a reason. Frank was already outside waiting when Carolyn pulled the car onto the long gravel driveway. Their farmhouse, once a proud piece of Callahan family history, had become a source of stress and financial strain. The failing crops, the mounting bills, the constant repairs, it was a weight that had worn Frank down. As she parked, Frank stepped off the porch, his brow furrowed. His boots crunched against the dirt, his tired blue eyes immediately locking onto the 3 massive German shepherds in the car. "What the hell is this, Carolyn?" Carolyn took a breath, stepping out of the car and handing him the crumpled note. "Read this." Frank glanced at Lucy, then at the dogs, then at the piece of paper in his hands. He sighed and unfolded it, his calloused fingers tracing over the shaky handwriting. As he read, his face darkened. He looked up at Carolyn, then at Lucy, who had already climbed out of the car, her arms wrapped securely around the lady's neck. "So, what are we supposed to do?" His voice was quieter than she expected. Carolyn glanced back at Max and Duke, still sitting rigid in the back of the car. "Waiting." Lucy answered before Carolyn could. "We help them." Frank ran a hand down his face, exhaustion and hesitation written all over him. Carolyn, we can't even afford to heat this house properly, let alone feed 3 giant dogs. And, he hesitated. Aren't you terrified of them? Carolyn swallowed. Yes, she was. But something about Max, the scarred leader, unnerved her in a different way. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Like he understood her boundaries, waiting for her to decide what came next. They're not just dogs, Frank, she murmured. They're trained, disciplined, and someone loved them enough to send them out looking for help. Frank exhaled through his nose, looking back at the 3 shepherds. And what if this Grayson guy comes looking for them? Silence hung between them. I don't know, Carolyn admitted. But I do know that they don't belong with him. Frank didn't argue. Instead, he opened the back of the car and gestured to the barn. One night, he said. That's it. Lucy beamed as she led Lady toward the barn. Carolyn expected Max and Duke to follow immediately, but instead, Max hesitated. Then, as if making a decision of his own, he padded over to Frank and sat, not at his feet, but beside him. Like an equal. Frank stared down at him, then let out a breath. All right. Guess we better feed them. That night, Carolyn couldn't sleep. The old farmhouse creaked with the weight of the wind, and the unfamiliar presence of 3 trained animals outside left her on edge. She lay awake for hours before finally giving in and creeping downstairs to check on them. The barn was cold, filled with the scent of hay and old wood. The dogs were still awake. Max sat at attention by the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness outside, while Duke rested uneasily on a pile of blankets. Lady had curled up near Lucy's discarded coat, like a guardian waiting for her charge to return. Carolyn hesitated before stepping forward. She knelt near Duke, who whined softly, his stomach rising and falling at an irregular rhythm. Something was wrong. She reached out, hesitating only a moment before parting his fur along his ribs. A swollen mass, firm, unnatural, pressed against his skin. Her heart clenched. It wasn't just the cold or exhaustion making Duke weak. He was sick. Forgetting her fear, she examined him carefully, her veterinary training pushing past her anxiety. This wasn't just a small issue. It was something serious. She exhaled and ran a hand down her face. They couldn't just send them away. Not like this. The next morning, Carolyn called Dr. Warner, her boss at the local veterinary clinic. Do you have space for an urgent exam? She asked. Dr. Warner frowned through the phone. Depends. What's the case? A German Shepherd. He was owned by a veteran. He has a mass in his abdomen. Silence. I'll make space, Dr. Warner said. Bring him in today. Carolyn exhaled. But just as she was about to hang up, the phone buzzed again. An unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? A man's voice. Sharp. Impatient. This is Thomas Grayson. Carolyn's blood ran cold. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Carolyn gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white as Thomas Grayson's voice carried through the static. I believe you have something that belongs to me. She forced herself to steady her breathing. The name alone had sent a shiver down her spine. Robert Callahan's note had warned about him. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, her voice measured but firm. A cold chuckle came from the other end. I think you do. 3 very valuable dogs. I have legal claim over them, and I expect their return. Carolyn swallowed hard. Then why were they abandoned in a grocery store parking lot? A pause. They weren't abandoned, Grayson said smoothly. They ran off. And I've been looking for them. Carolyn clenched her jaw. Liar. Look, lady, Grayson continued, his tone shifting to something more threatening. I'm being polite now. But if you don't return them, I'll get the authorities involved. Her pulse quickened. Could he really do that? She wasn't sure. But what she did know was that Robert Callahan hadn't trusted him. And neither did she. "You'll have to go through the proper legal channels," she said, keeping her voice even. "Until then, they're staying here." Grayson let out a slow exhale. "I was hoping we could settle this civilly. But suit yourself." The line went dead. Carolyn stood there for a long time, the quiet hum of the phone in her ear. She knew, in her gut, that Grayson wasn't going to back down. And somehow, she knew that keeping these dogs had just made her family a target. Frank was waiting for her in the kitchen when she finally set the phone down. His coffee sat untouched on the table, his eyes filled with equal parts exhaustion and concern. "Who was that?" he asked. Carolyn sighed and rubbed her temples. "Thomas Grayson." Frank's jaw tightened. "Already?" "He says he has a legal claim over the dogs." Frank let out a bitter laugh, running a hand over his unshaven face. "You think he actually cares about them?" "No," Carolyn admitted. "I think he wants whatever money they're worth." Frank shook his head, muttering something under his breath. "I knew this would turn into a mess." Carolyn's frustration flared. "Frank, I didn't ask for this, but we can't just turn them over to him. Duke is sick. He needs treatment, and Grayson sure as hell isn't going to pay for it." Frank rubbed his face again, his shoulders sagging under the weight of it all. "We can barely afford to keep the lights on, Carolyn. How are we supposed to pay for a dog surgery?" Carolyn didn't have an answer. Instead, she looked over at Lucy, who was sitting on the floor in the next room, brushing Lady's thick coat with small, careful strokes. The little girl's lips moved as if she were whispering to the dog, her small fingers working through tangles with practiced patience. For the first time since her mother's death, she looked at peace. And Carolyn knew they couldn't take that away from her. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Carolyn did something she hadn't done in 25 years. She voluntarily stepped into a barn with 3 large dogs. It took everything in her not to let fear seize her chest. The memory of teeth, of snarling, of the burning pain in her arm all wanted to take hold. But she pushed forward. Duke needed help. And fear had no place in a mother's duty. The old wooden floor creaked under her weight as she knelt beside him. His breath was shallow, his ribs rising and falling unevenly. She moved slowly, deliberately. Her fingers brushed over his fur, tracing the edges of the swollen mass in his abdomen. Duke didn't flinch. He just looked at her, dark eyes full of trust. She swallowed hard. How could she be afraid of something so pure? Max watched her from across the room, his sharp amber gaze steady, almost like he was measuring her. Seeing if she would fail this test. She wouldn't. Taking a deep breath, she wrapped a gentle hand around Duke's paw. "You're gonna be okay," she murmured. And for the first time, she believed it. Later that day, Carolyn loaded Duke into the back of the truck and drove him into town. Dr. Warner was waiting for them. After a series of scans and examinations, the diagnosis was clear: Duke had a mass pressing against his diaphragm. Without surgery, he wouldn't last more than 3 months. Carolyn's heart sank. "How much?" Dr. Warner hesitated. "At least $3,000. Maybe more." She let out a slow breath. They didn't have that kind of money. Not even close. Warner must have seen the defeat in her face, because he softened. "We have a fund," he said. "It won't cover everything, but it could help." Carolyn looked at Duke, who was resting on the exam table, his body weak but still full of quiet dignity. And she made up her mind. "We'll figure it out." That evening, just as the last of the Montana sun dipped behind the hills, a black sheriff's car pulled up the long gravel driveway. Carolyn and Frank exchanged wary glances before stepping out onto the porch. A tall man in a crisp uniform stepped out. "Mr. and Mrs. Adams?" Frank nodded. "That's us." The officer sighed and pulled a folded legal notice from his pocket. "I'm here about 3 German Shepherds. Thomas Grayson has filed an official claim of ownership. Carolyn's stomach dropped. However, the officer continued, lowering his voice, "Something about this doesn't sit right with me." Carolyn narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" The officer exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Grayson provided paperwork, but nothing solid. And frankly, when we asked around, we started hearing rumors that he's been trying to sell trained military dogs to private security firms." A cold chill ran through Carolyn. "I don't know what the truth is yet," the officer admitted. "But I do know that if these were just strays, they wouldn't have gone through hell to find you." He handed Carolyn the papers. "This buys you some time," he said. "But you'll need to fight this in court." Carolyn tightened her grip on the papers. Because if Grayson wanted these dogs, he was going to have to fight for them. And for the first time in her life, Carolyn wasn't afraid to fight back. Carolyn sat at the kitchen table long after the sheriff's car disappeared down the gravel driveway. The legal notice lay in front of her, the words stark and absolute. Thomas Grayson was challenging their right to keep Max, Duke, and Lady. Frank was pacing behind her, his heavy boots scuffing against the old wooden floor. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "This just keeps getting worse." Carolyn didn't respond. Her mind was already working through the problem. Grayson had legal paperwork, but they had something stronger, the truth. Somewhere out there, Robert Callahan was still alive. And if they could find him, they could prove that these dogs were never meant for Grayson. She reached for the yellowed note Callahan had left in the capsule, running her fingers over the shaky handwriting. "We need to find him," she said. Frank stopped pacing. "How?" "He's an old vet. He could be anywhere." Carolyn already had her phone in hand. "The VA." Frank frowned. "Think they'll just give you his location?" "No," Carolyn admitted. "But if we explain the situation, they might confirm whether he's alive, at least." She dialed the Montana Veterans Affairs office and waited as the call rang through. A receptionist answered, her voice clipped and polite. "This is Mary Caldwell, VA office, Billings. How can I help you?" Carolyn steadied herself. "Hi, I'm calling about a veteran named Robert Callahan. We recently found 3 dogs with identification leading back to him, and we believe he may be in trouble. We just need to confirm his whereabouts." A pause. Then the sound of fingers tapping on a keyboard. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't disclose personal information about our veterans." Carolyn expected that. She exhaled and softened her tone. "I understand. But this is urgent. His dogs, his service dogs, were found abandoned. They were left with a message that suggests he didn't intend for them to go missing." The tapping stopped. The receptionist hesitated. Then, her voice dropped slightly. "I can't tell you much," she said carefully, "but I can tell you that Robert Callahan was transferred to Magnolia Gardens Hospice in Bozeman 3 weeks ago." Carolyn's stomach tightened. Hospice. Frank, who had been listening, sank into the chair beside her. Hospice meant Callahan didn't have much time left. "Thank you," Carolyn whispered. "Ma'am," the receptionist added before hanging up, "if he wrote a message about those dogs, I'd take it seriously." Then the line went dead. Carolyn set the phone down and looked at Frank. "We have to go." Frank sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Bozeman is a 3-hour drive, Carolyn. And what if he's not coherent? What if it's too late?" Carolyn didn't blink. "Then at least we'll know we tried." Frank stared at her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket and truck keys. The highway stretched ahead in an endless ribbon of asphalt, flanked by rolling hills and clusters of evergreen trees. Lucy sat in the back seat, silent but alert, one hand resting on Lady's thick fur. Max and Duke lay curled in the truck bed, their ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. Carolyn kept one hand on her phone, waiting for any call, any sign that this wouldn't be in vain. She glanced at Frank. His hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. "This is crazy," he muttered. "We're driving across the state to see a dying man who doesn't even know us." Carolyn watched the road ahead. "No. We're driving across the state to see the only person who knows the truth." Frank didn't argue. And that, more than anything, told Carolyn that he wanted this to be right, too. The facility was quiet, nestled on the outskirts of town beneath the towering magnolia trees that gave it its name. The air smelled of pine and distant rain, and the sky had turned a soft, muted gray. A nurse met them at the door, her face kind but cautious. "You're here for Mr. Callahan?" Carolyn nodded. "If he's able to see visitors." The nurse hesitated. "His condition is fragile. He has good days and bad ones. But today is somewhere in between." Carolyn swallowed the lump in her throat. "We won't stay long," she promised. The nurse nodded and led them through a quiet hallway to a small private room with a window facing the trees. And there, lying against a hospital bed, was Robert Callahan. Even in illness, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a soldier. His silver hair was neatly combed, though his frame had been thinned by time and sickness. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale. But the moment Max, Duke, and Lady entered the room, his entire demeanor changed. His dull eyes sharpened, his lips trembled, and then, "My boys," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. Max let out a soft whine, stepping forward. Lady followed, her tail wagging hesitantly, as if she couldn't quite believe her own eyes. Duke, though weak from his illness, managed to drag himself forward, pressing his head against Callahan's frail hand. Callahan closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. "You found them," he whispered. Carolyn swallowed hard. "No," she said softly. "They found us." Callahan's breathing was uneven, but his hands remained steady as they stroked Duke's fur. "Thomas Grayson," Carolyn said after a moment. "He's trying to take them." Callahan's fingers tightened slightly. "Don't let him," he rasped. "He wants to sell them." Carolyn felt a chill crawl down her spine. "We need proof," Frank said. "We need something that can hold up in court." Callahan exhaled, then nodded toward the small wooden bedside table. "Top drawer." Frank opened it and pulled out a leather portfolio. Inside were bank statements, letters, and a document transferring ownership of Max, Duke, and Lady, signed by Robert Callahan himself. Callahan looked at Carolyn, his weak gaze filled with determination. "I was waiting," he said. "Waiting for someone to come for them." Carolyn's throat tightened. "We'll keep them safe." Callahan let out a slow, contented breath. "Good." Then, his eyes fluttered closed. And for the first time in months, he looked at peace. As they left the hospice, Carolyn clutched the portfolio against her chest. Frank started the truck, exhaling deeply. "We have what we need," he said. Carolyn nodded. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew. Grayson wasn't going to let them win without a fight. And the real battle was just beginning. The drive back to Helena felt heavier. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of oncoming rain, and the sky stretched gray and vast over the Montana plains. Carolyn sat in the passenger seat, clutching Robert Callahan's portfolio like a lifeline. Inside was everything they needed, legal proof that Callahan had transferred ownership of Max, Duke, and Lady to whoever could care for them best. There were also letters, records of his growing distrust toward Thomas Grayson, and notes about the dog's service history. She should have felt relief. But she didn't. She knew men like Thomas Grayson. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Frank gripped the steering wheel tight, his jaw locked. "If Grayson comes at us with lawyers, we might not win." "We have proof," Carolyn insisted. "More than that, we have the truth." Frank sighed. "Truth doesn't always win in court, Carolyn." From the back seat, Lucy's small voice cut through the silence. "Then we have to make them listen." The Davidson County Courthouse was an old brick building, its heavy doors and high ceilings meant to intimidate. The case had been fast-tracked due to Grayson's legal petition, and now, standing inside the polished halls, Carolyn felt the weight of what they were about to do. Frank adjusted his tie, the first time he'd worn one in years, while Lucy sat on a bench, stroking Lady's fur for comfort. Carolyn took a slow breath. Max and Duke weren't allowed inside, but Lady, being a certified emotional support animal, had been granted special permission to stay by Lucy's side. Then, the doors to the courtroom swung open, and in walked Thomas Grayson. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his dark eyes scanning the room with a confidence that made Carolyn's stomach turn. Beside him, his lawyer, a sharp-looking man with a leather briefcase, smirked like they had already won. The judge, a no-nonsense man in his 60s, took his seat. This court is now in session. And just like that, the battle began. Grayson's lawyer went first, painting a calculated picture of a grieving neighbor trying to uphold his friend's legacy. "My client was entrusted with these animals after Mr. Callahan's decline in health," he said smoothly. "Unfortunately, they wandered off before he could secure proper housing for them. The defendants had no right to take them." Carolyn's hands curled into fists. Then, it was her turn. She rose, took a deep breath, and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, these dogs weren't wandering. They were looking for help." She placed Callahan's note on the evidence table. This letter, written in his own hand, proves that Mr. Callahan did not trust Thomas Grayson to care for his dogs. He feared they would be sold. Grayson's lawyer scoffed. "That's speculation." Carolyn's heart pounded. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we visited Mr. Callahan at Magnolia Gardens Hospice 2 days ago. He confirmed everything in this letter before passing away." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Grayson's confidence flickered. "He's lying." Carolyn stood firm. "I have his signed transfer of ownership, complete with a witness signature from the VA hospital." She placed the documents on the table. The judge took a long moment, reviewing the papers. Finally, he spoke. "This is compelling evidence." He looked at Grayson. "Do you have proof that Mr. Callahan intended for you to have these animals?" Grayson's lawyer hesitated. Then, quietly, "No, Your Honor." Grayson's face darkened. He knew it, too. He had lost. Outside the courthouse, Carolyn finally exhaled. The ruling had been clear: the Adams family was the rightful caretakers of Max, Duke, and Lady. Frank squeezed her hand. "You did it." "No," Carolyn murmured. "We did." Lucy, who had been silent most of the trial, finally smiled. "They get to stay?" Carolyn knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "They get to stay." Lucy turned to Lady and whispered something into her fur. The dog wagged her tail as if she understood. Carolyn looked up at the sky, the weight in her chest lifting. Robert Callahan's dogs had found their way home. And somehow, in the process, so had they. The wind had settled by the time the Adams family left the courthouse, but the weight in Carolyn's chest had not. Even after the judge ruled in their favor, the finality of the moment took time to settle. The fight was over. Max, Duke, and Lady were staying with them, for good. Frank exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face as they walked toward the truck. "I still can't believe it. Feels like we've been fighting for a year instead of a few weeks." Carolyn nodded. "Because it wasn't just about the dogs, Frank. It was about doing what was right." Lucy held Lady's leash in her small hands, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Mr. Robert would be happy, wouldn't he?" Carolyn knelt beside her daughter and cupped her cheek. "Yes, sweetheart. I think he'd be very happy." As they climbed into the truck, Carolyn allowed herself to look back at the courthouse one last time. Thomas Grayson had left in silence. His lawyer hadn't even argued after the judge made his ruling. It was clear they never had a real case. But the damage Grayson had tried to do, his attempt to profit off the loyalty of those dogs, off Robert Callahan's dying wish, it left a bitter taste in Carolyn's mouth. She had no doubt that if he had won, Max, Duke, and Lady would have been sold to the highest bidder, never knowing another day of love or freedom. But they had been spared that fate, because they had chosen the right people. 2 days later, the Addams family returned to Magnolia Gardens Hospice for the last time. Robert Callahan's room was empty now, his bed stripped, his belongings packed away. The hospice staff had arranged a small memorial service at the Montana Veterans Cemetery, and though the ceremony was simple, it carried the quiet dignity of a soldier's farewell. Carolyn, Frank, and Lucy sat near the front. Max, Duke, and Lady lay by their feet, calm, still, perfectly disciplined. A retired Marine chaplain spoke briefly, recalling Callahan's service and his devotion to his animals. "It's rare for a man to leave this world with such a clear legacy," he said. "But Robert Callahan's legacy is alive, and it is standing before us today." Carolyn's throat tightened as she reached down to stroke Max's head. He had known all along. They all had. When the ceremony ended, Lucy stood quietly by Callahan's headstone, her hand resting on Lady's back. "Thank you," she whispered. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a fleeting moment, Carolyn could have sworn she felt a presence, something quiet, something approving. And she knew. Robert Callahan had finally found peace. The air smelled of damp earth and pine as the Addams family pulled back into their driveway. The familiar sight of their worn farmhouse, the weathered barn, and the open Montana fields stretched beneath a sky beginning to clear. It was strange how, despite everything that had changed in the past few weeks, the land remained the same, steady, unmoving, waiting. Carolyn stepped out of the truck first, followed by Frank, who let out a slow breath as he took in their home with fresh eyes. It didn't seem as small now, as burdensome. Lucy climbed down next, holding onto Lady's leash, her tiny fingers twisting into the dog's fur. Max and Duke hopped out of the truck bed, stretching their limbs before taking their usual positions, one on each side of Lucy, as if standing guard. They were home. And this time, they weren't just passing through. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that revolved not just around farm chores and late bills, but around 3 extraordinary dogs who had, in their own way, saved them. Max had claimed his role as protector of the land, patrolling the perimeter of the property each morning like a soldier on duty. Despite his age and the scar across his muzzle, his sharp instincts remained unmatched. Duke, though still recovering from surgery, had taken to sticking close to Frank, trailing behind him as he worked on the barn repairs. Frank, who once saw the dogs as just another burden, now reached absent-mindedly for Duke's head whenever he sat on the porch, rubbing the shepherd's ears as if they had always belonged there. Lady never left Lucy's side. At night, when nightmares still found their way into the little girl's mind, Lady would press close, her warmth and steady breathing acting as an anchor. The grief that once hollowed Lucy out now had a way of healing. Carolyn, for her part, no longer flinched when Max or Duke passed too close. She no longer hesitated to run her hands through their thick fur or press a reassuring touch to their heads when they leaned into her. She wasn't afraid anymore. Because she had learned something about fear, it dissolves in the face of love. One morning, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the Montana Veterans Affairs Office, notifying them that Robert Callahan had left behind a small trust fund for the continued care of his dogs. But there was something else, too. A second letter, handwritten in the same shaky script as the note they had found on Max's collar. To the Addams family. If you're reading this, it means I have gone. But I know, without a doubt, that my dogs are where they belong. They were trained to find those who needed them most, and they did just that. You may think you saved them, but I believe they saved you, too. Keep them together. Let them teach you what they have taught me, that loyalty is sacred, that love is something earned, and that family is more than just blood. Thank you. Robert Callahan. Carolyn's fingers trembled as she folded the letter back into the envelope. When she looked up, Frank was already watching her, his expression unreadable. "Guess we're keeping them," he murmured. Carolyn smiled. "We never had a choice." Frank exhaled, shaking his head, but there was a quiet acceptance in his eyes. Lucy, who had been listening silently, grinned and hugged Lady. They were always ours, she said simply. And she was right. They had been chosen long before they ever realized it. Months passed. Seasons changed. One afternoon, Carolyn found herself watching from the porch as Lucy played in the field with the dogs, Max standing watch, Duke following her every move, Lady running ahead with childlike excitement. The farm didn't feel so heavy anymore. For the first time in years, Carolyn felt like they were building something instead of just holding on. She knew Robert Callahan's dogs had arrived at their doorstep with a mission they hadn't fully understood at the time. But now, standing in the golden light of late autumn, Carolyn knew the truth. Max, Duke, and Lady hadn't just come to find a home. They had come to heal one. The first snowfall of the season came early that year. Carolyn stood at the kitchen window, watching the Montana landscape transform beneath a quiet blanket of white. The wind had softened, and the world outside seemed almost untouched, as if everything had been reset, cleansed by the cold. She wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. In the yard, Lucy was laughing, her breath visible in the crisp morning air as she tossed snow into the sky, sending Lady into a frenzy of joyful barks. Max stood nearby, his head high, scanning the horizon with his ever-watchful eyes. Duke, though still moving slower since his surgery, had settled near the porch, his thick coat dusted with snow, his ears flicking at every distant sound. Frank stepped up behind her, resting his hand on her shoulder. "They look happy," he murmured. Carolyn nodded. "They are." And for the first time in a long time, so was she. That night, as the house settled into its usual rhythm, Carolyn found herself thinking about Robert Callahan. She still carried his letter in her nightstand, tucked away like a treasure, its words woven into the very fabric of their new life. They were trained to find those who needed them most, and they did just that. She had never expected to learn so much from 3 dogs. But in the end, they had been the teachers all along. They had taught Frank that some burdens weren't meant to be carried alone. They had taught Lucy that love didn't disappear just because someone was gone. And they had taught Carolyn that fear doesn't have to be permanent. Late that evening, after Lucy had gone to bed, Carolyn stepped outside onto the porch. She stood there for a long time, listening to the soft rustling of trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the steady breathing of the dogs nearby. She didn't know if Robert Callahan had believed in fate or something greater than himself. But she did know one thing. These dogs had arrived at their doorstep with a purpose, a mission. And in saving them, they had saved the Adams family, too. She turned back toward the house, where Frank was waiting, where Lucy was dreaming, where 3 dogs, once lost, now found, lay curled up, safe and home at last. Carolyn smiled to herself, a quiet, knowing smile. "Good boy, Max," she whispered into the cold night. And just for a second, as the wind shifted through the trees, she could have sworn she heard a voice in the stillness. A whisper, carried on the Montana wind. "Mission accomplished,"